and we'll try to get as many of those answered as possible during the Q&A session. We are recording today's event, and at the end of the call, I'll be sharing a landing page link that you can visit to download a video, download today's deck, as well as other resources. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. Today we have three panelists. Chris Gable from HCA Healthcare. He's a consulting GRC application engineer with the Security Risk Intelligence team, and he is currently leading the GRC team, which focuses on building automation and workflows in RSA Archer. Chris joins us today from Nashville. Hello, Chris.
Good afternoon.
Also joining us from Nashville at HCA Healthcare is Jessica Hooton. Jessica is a consulting security risk controls engineer and part of the vendor security assurance team at HCA. She's responsible for vendor security risk management and has been on the HCA's Archer implementation team for the last 3 years. She's now a key developer for HCA's implementation of the Archer vendor management solution that we'll hear about later in the call. Welcome, Jessica. Thanks for joining us. And our third panelist today is John Hoyer, who is a senior GRC consultant with Iceberg, focused on finance and banking. John has 2 decades of experience working with enterprises on a variety of information technology and business process projects relating to governance, risk, and compliance. John joins us from Toronto, and I know he's a big Blue Jays fan, so John, after last night's win, you must be a very happy man today, am I right?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Hoping for the best.
I would like to turn things over to you now, John, to give us a quick introduction to supplier risk management, and then we'll have Jessica and Chris walk us through the implementations that's underway at HCA. So, John, I'll pass the baton over to you right now.
Thank you, Glenn. So supplier risk management, it's quite a large area, and it's been evolving quite substantially over the years. So when we're talking about building an effective supplier risk management program, we need to understand what that really means. What does it look like? What are some of the goals we should be working towards? A good place to start that conversation is by figuring out what questions a risk management program should be able to answer. These are questions from the operational staff as well as from senior management. If we were to look at a crystal ball, what answers would we like to see clearly? Some of the big ones are, who are your suppliers? That's not just a list of names, obviously. We want to know in depth, who are they? As well as who are your suppliers' suppliers? This is third party, fourth party, true supply chain management. We've seen lots of headlines where a subcontractor or an assignee has drastically impacted an organization. Which suppliers are most critical to your business? Are you exposed with any over-dependency on any one supplier? And how do you quickly assess, or how quickly can you assess new suppliers for risk? Some of these assessments can be very detailed, very lengthy. You get to a point where you have to have a trade-off is for how many questions are you asking, how detailed do you want to get, as well as when do you want to reassess them again. The information that you're getting from your supplier, do you trust it? How do you verify it? That's where we start getting into due diligence and allowing your senior management team to trust the information you're receiving. Also, you want to know what opportunities your vendors can help you achieve, getting into speed to market, operational efficiency, etc. All of these questions will contribute to questions that senior management might be asking. The biggest ones are really around risk. Where am I exposed? And how you use these answers from your suppliers will help you formulate the answers to senior management. When we start talking about vendor relationships, the number of types of relationships that an organization will engage in. Everything from where an organization deposits money or gets liquidity from, to hardware software providers, raw material suppliers, and everything in between. These relationships can provide many benefits to organizations, but they also introduce many risk and performance considerations. It could be source of business disruptions, compliance violations, information security breaches, financial losses, and strategic damage. From a couple of surveys earlier in the year, 42% of companies now describe themselves as highly vulnerable to vendor or supplier and procurement fraud. 90% of all FCPA, that's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, involve third parties. Most organizations have a pretty good idea of their first level suppliers, in other words, organizations who they contract with directly. But it's a very different story when you start to think about third-party risk, your supplier's suppliers. Then you get into fourth-party risk and so on, and that's where you start getting into the true supply chain management. The chart here on the right side of this display is an Ernst & Young survey of financial institutions released earlier this year. I would imagine for any complex organization, the numbers are similar. Certainly, most large companies we talk to have numbers in the thousands or tens of thousands of suppliers. A couple of questions you might ask. What portion of the third parties are within the scope of your organization's risk management program? Also, if you have a better understanding of your third-party relationships, would you be in a better position to reduce the number of third parties?
That's interesting, John, because I know one of the findings in that EY survey is as maturity, supplier risk management maturity increased, they actually have found over the years that the numbers on the high end have started to go down. So that would support what you're suggesting there.
Yeah, definitely seeing that in some clients. When we're talking to areas of risk, now we're not going to go into all of these. Most of these will be fairly familiar to most of you on the call here. A lot of these are very common across the board. Information security, privacy, financial examples. These are all very common that companies are used to reporting on and collecting information on. Where it's starting to get a little bit more complex is when we're dealing with strategic risk and concentration risk. So if we think, for example, concentration risk, you may have one supplier working on a handful or a large number of independent engagements. Each one of them is not really significant, but combined, they could, if something were to happen with this supplier, they could drastically impact your business. So that's more of a concentration risk. Or if a large number of your suppliers are in a given geopolitical area, there could be ramifications there, as well as compliance obligations. They're not as easy to track and report on. Often pockets of vendor profiles, details of engagements, risk and performance data are spread across different teams within the organization. You might have centers of governance for privacy, information security, finance, for example. Each team talks about risk using different language and different measurements, controls, and reporting. As a result, it becomes difficult to find a single source of truth about third-party dependencies, risk, and performance. Without a consistent enterprise view of risk or a common taxonomy, your executive team does not have a clear picture to make business decisions. We're going to talk later in the seminar about some of the regulatory pressures.
All right, thank you, John. I'd like to hand things over now to Jessica and Chris. We'll start with Jessica from HCA.
Thank you, Glenn. So we are part of HCA, which has been operating for almost 50 years out of Nashville, Tennessee. We are the world's largest for-profit operator of healthcare facilities in the United States, and we also have facilities in England. I think what is important to note on this slide is if you look at the size of our organization, our number of patients and number of employees, we are a massive organization that covers a lot of territory. And it's very important when it comes to risk, and also very important in a lot of the challenges and the goals that we're facing today. Just in the number of patients that we get each year alone, from our perspective and looking at this 26 million number, that is a number in terms of vendor management. How many of our devices owned or managed by vendors could come into contact with a patient? And it's a little bit of a scary thought. So it's definitely one of our biggest drivers for vendor management at our organization. So over the course of the last 18 months or so, we have identified and faced a lot of challenges that we're currently working toward. Looking at the decentralization, that is really one of the biggest things that we are trying to tackle up front. It creates a lot of levels of redundancy throughout HCA. For example, we have so many facilities, we have so many different contracting systems that are separated from what we have at our corporate level, so it's very difficult to get a consolidated bird's eye view of vendor performance throughout the organization. And with that said, we're finding out that as we approach vendors that they're being asked the same questions over and over and being assessed in the same way many times throughout the year by all of our different facilities that have no way of disseminating this information throughout the enterprise because everything today is done manually and using spreadsheets. So with that, we are trying to tackle these challenges through centralization of data, standardization of automated assessments, identifying owners throughout the organization to accept risk and work on remediation efforts with our vendors, and also defining the roles and responsibilities. At the end of the day, we not only want to provide reporting of our vendor security risk to management, but we want to be able to tackle risk as a whole and provide all vendor risks in financial areas and legal areas and strategy to everyone throughout the organization that is responsible for making these decisions when it comes to our vendors and our potential vendors. So now I'll hand it over to Chris.
So just to give you a little background on why we chose Archer in the first place. So before we really started to tackle what we're calling, our vendor management, we were already using Archer for risk management, for incident management, issue management, policy management. So we had a lot of governance and processes wrapped around, generating findings and how are those remediated, how does that link to our authoritative sources, our internal control standards and procedures, as well as, how does that link to our risk register items and roll up to our enterprise risk. So it was an easy win for our team to say, hey, Archer already has these other capabilities. We're standardizing across the company as far as policy management goes and generating this risk. How about we also include some of our vendor issues as well? We can use this tool. At the end of the day, because we were already using Archer, it was easy for us to kind of make the purchase as well. We've got contracts in place with Archer or with RSA already. The cost to add in the vendor module was a lot less than buying some of these standalone solutions that we had already looked at. We're also in a process of making a big push of aligning all of our internal standards and procedures as well as the frameworks that we've been using over the years to identify some of our risk and some of our compliance issues to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So Archer gave us the flexibility to kind of map in all those disparate authoritative sources to given subcategories. Now that we have vendor management, we're able to see kind of the gaps necessarily across the enterprise with vendor management, as well as and how that incorporates with some of the controls that we may be using for on-prem or internal risks and solutions. We have been able to, with Jessica's help, she's been able to tie a lot of our vendor risks into our primary risk register, and so now it's not a separate process. It's not a procurement problem. It's not a vendor risk issue. It is a enterprise risk that we can now tackle as an organization instead of having these disparate sources of processes and truth. So you don't have a facility and a division doing things differently. We can now standardize our processes and our procedures across the enterprise, hopefully reduce some duplication of effort. Jessica had mentioned, one of our goals was we want to be able to ask once, answer many. Archer also gives us that opportunity, between the authoritative sources being mapped to our question library questions, or even using some of Archer's advanced data feed capability, we could map seemingly disparate questionnaires to each other. So if we had already asked a vendor a specific question that may be related to SIG-Lite, we could then map some of those SIG-Lite questions into our HTA-specific vendor questionnaire. The other big thing that it will be able to give us the capability for that we're hoping to strive for in 2017 is, how can we even get rid of some of these assessments? How can we take certifications in lieu of some of these questionnaires? And Archer gives us all that that ability to kind of take existing processes, streamline it. We can use existing questionnaires and findings, map it into Archer, and just start moving through.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Chris. It's a great introduction. Number of things that came up that I want to hone in on. Chris, maybe we could start. You mentioned you now look at this as an enterprise risk rather than a procurement risk or an IT risk. I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on how that ownership of risk or how the perception of supplier risk has changed over the last 12 to 18 months as you've gone through this project.
Yeah, so initially, risk was owned by whoever owned the contract. So if you had a contract at a facility level, your financially responsible individual would own that risk. By kind of consolidating some of these processes, the hope is that, we have a risk management department. They're setting the direction for what we consider risks as a company. They can own some of that risk. At the end of the day, we do still roll up a lot of our risk to either the CFO or the CEO or our CIO. So we do have executives that will go through our risk register. They sign off on our thresholds and our metrics. And at the end of the day, we do try to associate a lot of that risk to some of our company, the executives from the company.
John, I'm curious about your experience with some of the financials you've worked with. What's the view, in your opinion, who should own risk, or any thoughts on that, the siloed approach to risk management when it comes to suppliers and vendors?
Yeah, it's a common challenge with many organizations where risk management or GRC has often started in the IT department and kind of evolved through organizations using IT terminology or taxonomy. A lot of these organizations, even supplier risk, in large organizations, have started at a tactical level, possibly using a different tool, but certainly a different methodology. And the challenge that's really popping up across the board is rolling it up to an operational risk, reporting together, and then ultimately up to enterprise risk. Whereas the driver really should come down from the top. Here's our enterprise risk strategy, and down to operational risk, et cetera. And even if they're implemented, the programs are implemented at a tactical level or a business unit level, they should all contribute to the overall strategy. So that's one of the challenges we're having, and one of the directions we're helping our clients work towards. Certainly in finance, just given the size of the organizations, but certainly there's lots of industries that would apply to as well.
Okay. Jessica, I wanted to ask you, we keep hearing that supplier risk, vendor risk, third-party risk is probably the #1 risk management use case. And I'm curious about why that is, in your opinion. Why is it such a hot topic in the industry right now?
So for us, I think a lot of, and it could be applicable to other industries as well, you have the major breaches that have occurred over the last couple of years, such as Target and Anthem and Community Health Systems. Those have really given a lot of insight, I think, into people realizing that they really need to start focusing on this. Also, I know you had mentioned previously at the beginning of the webinar, regulation. We're heavily regulated, as is the financial sector. So HIPAA and high-tech, and even over in Europe, we have the EU Data Protection Directive that we have to be aware of, and ensuring that our business associates are following those same controls that we're following at a minimum standard. Recently, in the news, there's been a lot of rage, I guess, around ransomware, and that has really opened our eyes, and we've had to kind of adjust a little bit from the breach perspective and look toward ransomware, and also include within that scope our medical devices. Earlier, I had mentioned that we have so many patients that come through our hospitals every day that it is one of our fears that something that could happen to a patient connected to a medical device that's not managed by us. So that's really something that we are trying to target as part of this department within our organization, or this initiative. I think the other thing that is surprising is that there is an overwhelming number of vendors that we have found in our organization that are small size vendors. So you want to focus a lot of times on your larger strategic vendors, but you have an overwhelming number of smaller vendors that lack minimum security practices that you see in other areas, and you don't realize the breadth or how many you have until you really start digging and identifying your inventory.
Right, and sometimes it's the smallest ones that may pose the biggest risk. So, John or Chris, did you want to add anything to Jessica's comments there on just why supplier risk is such a focus these days for organizations?
It's John. From my point, obviously a lot of these organizations, they're worried about reputational risk as well, and the simple version is they don't want to become a headline. You've seen it so many times where, through no fault of their own directly, it might be a supplier or a third-party, fourth-party supplier has lost information, like an information breach or non-compliance of some kind. That's obviously something they're very concerned about.
So I guess related to this, I would imagine that leaderships and executives in your organization are very focused in on this. Chris or Jessica, by implementing Archer, by maturing that process, are you able to better answer the questions that your executives or your board are asking about supplier risk? Are they getting the information that they need in a more complete way now?
They are, and like I had mentioned before, just having a way to centralize all of the data and metrics and findings and everything, that has really helped us roll that information up to any level, not even at the executive level, but without that we could not have aggregated this information in any way. So it's automated our spreadsheets for us, and it's allowed us to report at any level of the organization, which is really what we were looking for, in addition to just being able to report to the executive management.
Okay. I also want to remind folks, if you have any questions for our panelists, by all means use our Q&A panel up on the side of the screen, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have. John, I wanted to ask you, you've done work with a variety of organizations on supplier and third-party risk projects, especially financials. Do you see any trends, or what are you seeing from companies that are trying to push the envelope a little bit further of what's typically thought of as being supplier risk management?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of these programs or solutions, Archer included, they cover all of the typical areas of risk that we went on a previous slide: IT risk, privacy, etc. They're very accustomed to doing that. Some have become very mature at it, with having internal centers of governance and building all together to get a solid picture of a supplier, either third party, fourth party. But what they're asking for more and more is what we're loosely terming external COGS, or external centers of governance. So an example might be Dun & Bradstreet research reports, either on specific suppliers, vendors, or geographical regions, or upcoming compliance, industry or legislative rules that are coming up that might impact you, and leveraging that information, building into the solution a third-party news feed where one of your suppliers makes a headline and it's potentially bad news, that someone should be aware of it quickly. At least, these 10 engagements and initiatives may be impacted by this piece of news. On top of that, a large one is reporting. Reporting is getting more and more advanced. I don't think any one tool masters reporting, so they're looking for more and more options to really create some analytics, business intelligence, either having a QBI tool layered on top of Archer and other tools, or Archer with other solutions for spend out analytics, for example, given suppliers. And every situation is different. It presents its own challenges, but we're addressing a lot of these and forcing us to think outside the box and delivering some pretty interesting results.
You're breaking up just a little bit there at the end, John, but maybe I'll move on to Jessica or Chris. We have a lot of organizations tuning in today who are probably fairly early in their process and just looking at getting started with developing their supplier risk management program. And I was wondering, based on your experience over the past few months, do you have any general pieces of advice for organizations who are just looking to get started with the project? Jessica or Chris?
Sure. So in an organization of our size, we couldn't have lifted this program off the ground initially without some kind of GRC software. And in our case, it was Archer. We were using it in-house. We had developers around it. It was the best thing for us to do, and also to connect with our enterprise risk register. A lot of the guidance and white papers that I have read throughout the years that are available come off as very prescriptive and recommend step-by-step how to implement a mature process, and we found quickly that we couldn't follow those step-by-steps. So for us, getting started with Archer really was the best approach for us. We used a lot of its core functionality, and we were able to use something to show our progress of our department forming and our processes. We were able to show process quickly by starting with that. Also, Archer has fostered a huge community for us, so we have been able to connect with other organizations, even in other industries that are in our same boat or that are more mature than we are, and it's been extremely helpful to connect with other organizations and understand their what has been a challenge for them and how they've overcome that, and kind of being able to prioritize based on their experience. That has definitely been a huge help to us. So I would say definitely get involved in any kind of communities you can with other organizations, just to have that sounding board to help you along the way. I think the other thing that I kind of touched on a little bit before is that when we started our program, it was when breaches were really popular in the news. And then over the last couple of months, ransomware and medical devices have really spun up to be a little bit, taken a lot of the focus off of breach. And so I would just say be prepared when either building your risk register and coming up with questions for your assessments, or even assigning weightings to any of the answers that you're expecting back, is be prepared to reevaluate your risks at any given time, or at least set up a frequent basis so that you can adjust and go forward.
Okay, we do have a couple questions from our audience. One tactical and one a little more strategic. Let me start with the tactical one for Jessica or Chris. Two parts to it. How many vendors are you tracking within your organization, and how often are you doing assessments?
So today we've scoped down to about 1,800 to 1,000 vendors. We have many more, but that is what we're focusing on today. As far as assessments go, we're doing them on an annual basis, but we are in the process of developing ways that we can prioritize and assign thresholds so that we can determine if we need to do some vendors more quickly or more frequently or less frequently.
Okay, so it has allowed you to be able to have that prioritization then.
Yes, Archer has been very helpful, especially in, I mentioned that we used a lot of its core functionality, especially in a lot of the calculations that already exist, and just being able to have that information manually come out, or not manually come out, but automatically come out of all this information coming in. It has been very helpful.
Okay. Well, and then on the strategic side, can you give any examples of some of the high-level value that your vendor risk program has helped to realize? That's a big question. Put you on the spot with that one.
So from a high-level strategic, we're pretty new in our implementation as well, so we don't really have like an ROI where we can say, well, it's saved the company this amount of money, or we've been able to do these things because of risk management. But just from our early entry into the implementation, we are seeing reporting functionality decrease in time. That's the big thing for us at the moment is prior to the implementation, we had a lot of disparate sources, duplication of effort. We've been able to streamline that effort. And as Jessica said earlier, we're able to report to any level of the business now, whereas before we may have to contact multiple departments and pull together metrics from disparate sources and try to get presentations together that may take 2 or 3 weeks. We have all these reports already built in because we're automating that workflow and that data flow into Archer.
And I think the other thing too is we've noticed a lot of time saving. We are also using Archer to bring in information about our contracts from all of the different contracting systems. So it gives someone maybe at one of our facilities in Colorado access to be able to look at, okay, are all of the appropriate agreements or contracts already in place for this vendor that I'm considering purchasing something from? So before they didn't have that visibility just because everyone has different systems that they're using and the decentralization. Now they're able to go in and see that. So it takes a lot of time out of the process of being able to go ahead and quickly engage those vendors. And it's really critical when it comes down to being an industry we're in, of having patience and needing to save lives and being able to make quick decisions.
Okay, well, you sort of answered one of the next questions, which is how are you cataloging third-party contracts? So you are cataloging that or in the process of cataloging that through the Archer platform in a centralized way. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, so we have external counsel and internal counsel, but we do, and they maintain their own contract management system, so we don't have the detailed contracts within Archer, but we do bring in vendor profiles. We bring in engagements based on contracts. We can roll up contract risk to engagements and then eventually, aggregate that to a vendor profile. So we do have an external contracting software, but we sync that on a daily basis into Archer so we can get an idea of who our vendors are and what they're providing for us. Some of those contracts also allow us to designate some level of impact. It's how large is the implementation, how much, what type of data is being transferred. Is it a cloud solution? Is it a medical device? So we have some classifications of these vendors and what they're providing for us because of that automation with the contracting software.
Okay. We have a question from one of our listeners about risk measurement result format. Not exactly sure what's meant by that question, but if anyone wants to jump in, Chris, Jessica, or John. John?
Yeah, I could speak to that from experience from a couple of recent large clients. As an example, we are capturing inherent risk, control rating, and obviously calculating residual risk at a per risk element level. So let's take privacy and IT risk as an example. We're in most cases we're using a 5-level scale, but there's no reason you can't use a 3-level scale. The important part is that you try to use a common scale across the enterprise so that medium high means the same thing from privacy to IT to compliance. In this example I'm thinking of, we're calculating at an engagement level what the independent risk levels might be for privacy, IT risk, finance, etc. We're rolling up to an overall engagement risk using the same scales, weighting some of the risk elements higher than others, and then ultimately up to a supplier risk. If there's more than one engagement, we're taking, in some cases, we're taking a max of the engagement risks. In some cases, we're taking a weighted average. It depends on the client's needs. The important part is that you should be able to roll up in a consistent manner, and ultimately, your overall supplier risk management program should be able to roll up to an operations risk. If you think of a privacy risk, that's really a center of governance to supplier risk. Supplier risk is really just a center of governance into operational risk. It should be able to report up in the same way. I'm hoping that answers the question.
Yes, it does, says our listener. Thanks, John. We've talked about a lot with HCA about where you've been so far. I'm always interested in learning where you're going, what's on the horizon, what's next for your supplier risk program. Jessica or Chris,
Sure.
what's next for HCA?
Sure. So we have, when we started our process, we decided to look out throughout the organization and see, okay, well, we know we're already asking a ton of questions multiple times to all of our vendors. Let's identify a lot of those processes that are currently doing assessments, and let's automate those. So we automated those, and we started our assessments. We decided we wanted to have a standardized assessment process. We started with all of our legacy vendors and assessing those vendors on an ongoing basis. So our next step is to hook more into our contracting process so that we can prevent risks from being introduced into the organization via any new vendor relationships that are coming. We're a little bit hooked in, but we definitely want to become more hooked in. As Chris had mentioned earlier, we're also still working more and more with our integration with the internal risk register using both the vendor management module and the risk module of Archer, which has definitely been a challenge and has been fun to try to tackle. And also, and Chris can probably speak more to this, but it's along the contracting side, we are looking to put KPIs and SLAs, collect that information from vendors using our external vendor portal, putting that into Archer and being able to report and measure upon those as well.
Yeah, and to mirror what John said earlier, we've been, when he was talking about, how you define and communicate risk, we're also in this process of moving forward. We have this enterprise risk management department. They have a certain criteria for how to classify risk, whether that's the high, medium, low scale. And so we've been developing a matrix as we bring more departments into Archer and start looking at their risk. We're developing this basic matrix of, okay, if you have this type of risk, it goes to this scale. If you have these types of likelihood factors or these impact factors. So whether they're using qualitative or quantitative risk, we can give a centralized look in a common language for how we're reporting risk up. The other thing is, Jessica and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about, we're doing these great things with automating assessments. We're bringing in our legacy vendors. We're kicking off all of these disparate assessments that other departments are doing. We're bringing it into Archer. So if you fill out this assessment, you answer this question this way, it kicks off this other assessment that you also have to fill out. And our question was, assessments are all the rage right now. We got to assess our vendors. At some point, you're going to get to this line where we have assessment fatigue on our vendors, and we could have potentially two options. The smaller vendors say, hey, we're small, this is just not worth our time, we can't do it, so they're not going to fill out an assessment. Or you have really big vendors that are like, you guys are just a small portion of our portfolio, we don't need to do this, we're not going to do it. So you either need to play ball with us or, we're not going to fill out your assessment. So we're talking about how can we take these existing certifications that a company may have. We don't have the resources that go out and do audits of all of our vendors. So how can we take their SOX certification or their PCI certification and map those into Archer automatically so we can say, okay, give us proof of your internal pen test or give us some certifications, and we're going to map those into our assessments. So we may go from an assessment of 160 questions down to 10. So how can we limit what we actually have to ask the vendor that they've already been asked before? And there's a lot of talk about shared assessments and how we can kind of standardize some of our questions based on industry instead of doing these HCA-specific questionnaires.
John, I'm sure that's something you're seeing the financial side of things as well. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. If you think of any kind of supplier that might be specializing in the finance or insurance or any of these types of industries, they're going to be going after not only your organization, but they're trying to get business with your competitors locally or across the country, across the continent, globally. And they're being asked to fill out these assessments by each of your competitors as well. So making them streamlined, but still giving you the information you need is becoming more and more critical. Absolutely.
All right. Well, we are out of audience questions, so this is probably a good time to wrap things up. I want to say a big thank you to Chris, to Jessica, and to John for participating today in the call. I have set up a landing page on the Iceberg website, icebergnetworks.com/SRM, and you'll find a copy of today's presentation deck there. Later on this afternoon, we'll be posting a copy of the video as well, and there's some other resource links as well that we'll add to that page. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Again, thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today. I hope this was a useful discussion for you, and have a great afternoon.